Welcome everyone to this special Six to Celebrate virtual walking tour. My name is Wayne Benjamin. I am a longtime resident of Audubon Park, and I am a member of the Board of Advisors of the Historic Districts Council, in addition to being chair of the Land Use Committee for Manhattan Community Board 12, and that's a community board that serves the Washington Heights Inland neighborhood, which of course includes Audubon Park. The Historic Districts Council is the advocate for New York City's historic neighborhoods, and its mission is to ensure the preservation of significant historic neighborhoods, buildings, and public places in New York City, as well as to uphold the integrity of New York City's landmarks law and to further that preservation ethic. Six to Celebrate, of which this virtual walking tour is a component, is it's a dynamic program of HDC, and it's frankly one of the city's only targeted checklists of preservation priorities. So we are going to be looking at the Audubon Park neighborhood, but we're going to be looking at it through the lens of a new book that was written by my neighbor, Matthew Spady, and that book is entitled The Neighborhood Manhattan Forgot, Audubon Park and the Families Who Shaped It. And we're going to be looking at the neighborhood, through time. So I'm going to begin by orienting you to, what Audubon Park looks like today. But then we're going to go back in time and, walk us through the steps that, got us to where we are now. So just to give you a sense, Manhattan Community Board 12, Washington Heights Inwood begins at 155th Street, and Audubon Park is literally located at the southernmost end of, the community board. The Audubon Terrace complex, which is a cultural arts complex, was designated as a historic district in 1979 and subsequently was listed on the National Register in 1980. Audubon Park, which is an interlocking companion historic district that includes residential buildings, was designated in 2009. If we move to the next slide, we'll get some images of what the neighborhood looks like today. This is the southern end of Audubon Park, and what we're looking at here is the wall of the Audubon Terrace complex. And from my perspective, this complex is quite interesting because it is what drew me to the neighborhood. I grew up in Manhattan, but I grew up on the east side, and on the west side, I was familiar probably coming up as far north as the City College. But when I came back from grad school, I would hop on a bus and just see, take it to the end of the line, see where it goes. And so one time I was on the M4, and when I got to 155th Street, I saw this wonderful complex of buildings and said, what is this? I had to get out and explore. And so I ended up living, literally within 2 blocks of this. But, this is the original Audubon Terrace complex, sort of the neoclassical architecture. If we move to the next slide, the Audubon Park complex, as I mentioned, the Audubon Park Historic District includes the residential buildings. So what we're looking at is actually my home, the Grinnell, and further in the background, but still on the left-hand side, is the Riviera, or 790 Riverside Drive. So these are 2 of the grand pre-war buildings that are part of the Audubon Park Historic District. The next slide. This is Crillon Court. Crillon Court is across the street from the Riviera and from the Grinnell. And as we continue along Riverside Drive going towards the river, we see once again on the left we have the Riviera, then we have Rhinecliff, which is 788 Riverside Drive, and then we have Volk Hall, which is 780 Riverside Drive. And this is as Riverside is curving, from 155th Street coming inland, or if you're going reverse, it's curving going back towards the river. At that curve, we come into 765 Riverside Drive, and this building is actually, its physical form is taking that curve of Riverside Drive as it pulls in. If we move to the next slide, some of the side streets may not have apartment buildings that are as grand as the ones that we were looking at on Riverside Drive, but they are nonetheless, you know, architecturally quite interesting, quite handsome. These are streetscapes along 156th Street and 157th Street between Broadway / Edward Morgan Place and Riverside Drive. So that gives you a sense of what architecturally, some, not all, some of the buildings in the, you know, the interlocking historic districts look like. But I guess the question is, if we look at this map and we look at this streetscape, you will see it really doesn't follow the typical Manhattan grid. You know, the 1811 grid is a defining characteristic of urbanized, you know, Manhattan, but Audubon Park does not follow that neutral grid. And I guess the question to be asked, and, you know, the question that will then lead us to walking through, you know, is why? I mean, we were looking at Riverside Drive curving inland, meandering, you know, uphill and then back towards the river. So I guess the first question, you know, for us to explore with Matthew is, you know, why is it that, you know, the urban fabric of Audubon Park as it is today differs from, you know, that neutral Manhattan grid that so characterizes the rest of the island?
Thanks a lot, Wayne, and thanks very much for that introduction to Audubon Park. Thanks also to HDC for sponsoring the event, and to all the folks who joined us tonight. I love nothing better than talking about Audubon Park and its history. And Wayne, you gave me the perfect lead in, because when I do walking tours of Audubon Park, I usually focus on how our streetscape, how our footprint disrupts Manhattan's grid. If you look at the map there, you see over on the left, which is on the west side of Audubon Park, Riverside Drive sort of snaking through. On the right, you see Edward M. Morgan Place, which is going at an angle up towards Riverside Drive. Edward M. Morgan Place is actually a remnant of the Boulevard Lafayette, which was a long roadway going around the top of the island. But we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But what's interesting is how our 21st century footprint has echoes of earlier periods in it. So let's go to the next slide, which has a map which comes from the book. This was created by cartographer Jeffrey Ward. He did 9 maps for the book. All of them are really quite spectacular. On the left there, you see Audubon Park as it appeared in the 1890s, about maybe 10 to 12 years before it actually disappeared beneath the streetscape that Wayne was showing you just a moment ago. On the southern side, you have 155th Street. On the northern side, you have 158th Street. And then the Boulevard, which is now called Broadway, it has been called Boulevard, 11th Avenue, and of course now Broadway, marked the eastern side of Audubon Park. So you can see that it was really a very sort of defined area. It was rectangular. I will note, though, that if you look at the top, William Wheelock, William Foster, and over there to the right at 158th Street, Lavinia Hawley, they all spoke of themselves as living in Audubon Park. Often, as you probably know about your own neighborhoods, neighborhoods are defined by whoever is speaking. But generally speaking, Audubon Park extended from 155th to 158th west of the Boulevard. Now, when we take back those layers of history, we can see how it began to evolve. And one of the things we're going to talk about today is not only how we got to the footprint that we have, but how we didn't have certain other footprints that might have evolved if certain individuals at times, and at times the city, had made different choices. The first one actually was well before Audubon Park ever existed. And that was when the city fathers decided that they needed some sort of plan for the city. They couldn't actually decide upon one, and the state legislature stepped in and appointed a commission of 3 men who developed what became Manhattan's grid. Wayne, here's a map of the grid. What are some of the key
Right.
things
So, I mean,
that you can point out?
looking at here, I mean, you'll notice how, as I mentioned before, there's this neutral grid. It's neutral in that it really does not pay attention to or follow the topography of the island, Manhattan or Manhattos or the various different, I mean, it means hilly island. And, you have this grid that basically, expects or, the island to be flat that's laid out up to 155th Street. So the interesting thing is when this grid was established, New York City was a compact town, basically down at the southern end of the island. And when the grid was established, it was not anticipated that urbanization north of 155th Street would, happen, in the immediate decades or even within the century, following the establishment of the grid. The grid was intended to provide an orderly means to sell and develop land from 14th Street to 155th Street, and to discourage land speculation, although one can argue by logically laying out streets and blocks, it made it easier to develop and easier to speculate, but that's a conversation for some other time. But the critical thing is looking at this map, you'll see that the grid stops where our community, what's now Manhattan Community Board 12, Washington Inwood, where we begin, the grid ends.
Exactly. And it's interesting because with the grid stopping there at 155th Street, development north of that could have happened in lots of different ways. Actually, development north of there almost was cut off because of a scheme in the 1830s. And that scheme was actually land speculation, which the commissioners supposedly were trying to avoid happening in northern Manhattan. So within 20 years, here was some land speculation. There's a fellow named James Connor. He was a printer. He had made quite a fortune. He had a stereotype version of the Bible that the American Bible Society sold. And he had a scheme for a rural cemetery. So he bought up roughly 90 acres, stretching across as far south as about 151st Street and up to about 158th. And he had heard that the Common Council, the Board of Aldermen, wanted to develop a rural cemetery beyond the city's borders. So Connor bought this property and offered it to the city. The city sort of debated this for about 18 months. During that time, Richard Carman, who was famous for developing Carmansville, which we'll mention again later in the conversation, but Richard Carman and James Connor went into business together. Connor sold Carman a half interest in this whole project. As I say, it went on for about 18 months. They actually had it surveyed because the city wanted to be sure that the land was suitable for a cemetery. And they hired a fellow named Richard Tone, who was farming the land that Connor owned. Richard Tone surveyed it, and he gave a glowing description of the land. He said that he had dug several places, I think it was like 20 or 30 places, and he had only found rock in 2. Now, if you have ever been to Trinity Cemetery and seen all of the rocky outcroppings, you can imagine this was a bit of a sort of optimistic view of what the land was like. Anyway, the Common Council, the Board of Aldermen, decided that they were going to do something different. They left Connor and Carman holding the bag. They had bought the land on speculation, so they had borrowed on it, and they lost it. The Bowery Life Insurance Company foreclosed on the land about 1837. Carman kept on with his land speculation. He owned quite a bit of land, both north and south of this point. Connor, it seems, gave up on land speculation. However, in 1841, the Bowery Life Insurance Company resold the land that they had taken. Carman repurchased 24 acres of it. And the next thing he did was 18 months later, he sold it to Trinity Church, And Trinity Church then developed the rural cemetery that Carmen and Connor had been talking about. Trinity Church yard was already full with bodies and they needed extra space. And so they bought this 24 acres. They hired a landscape architect to develop it. The idea of a rural cemetery was that it was a combination of burial land, and parkland, so that you could visit your dead not in a churchyard or in some desolate location, but in an area where you could contemplate death rather positively. And so it had elements of the landscape you can see in this particular picture here, which is from about 1860. There were roads, people could actually promenade through there, they could take their carriages through. It became a really popular destination in Manhattan, Trinity Cemetery did, in the second half of the 19th century. Now, at the same time that Connor bought his land, John James Audubon.
Matthew, let me just interject for a second.
Certainly, Wayne.
I forgot to mention to everyone when we began that if you have any questions, we are using the chat function and we will address all questions at the end of the presentation. So please type them into the chat. They are being monitored, and when we get to the end of the presentation, we'll then have a conversation that includes responses to those questions. Back to you, Matthew.
Thanks very much, Wayne. So in 1841, John James Audubon, at the same time that Richard Carman was repurchasing his land for Trinity Cemetery, which you can see on this map there between 153rd and 155th, Audubon bought a triangle, a large triangle. It's the dark section there on the map. It began roughly at 10th Avenue and 155th Street. And do bear in mind that when I make reference to these streets, most of them were not developed at the time. 10th Avenue was developed, but and Kings Bridge Road was developed, but the cross streets, most of them were not, neither was Broadway or any of the other streets in the neighborhood, but they're very good to use for coordinates so that we can place them in our contemporary thought here. So Audubon's farm went from about 10th Avenue and 155th all the way to the high watermark out in the river. Then it went north up to about 157th Street and then zoomed right back to where it began. About 18 months later, his elder son, Victor, bought 3 smaller triangles and attached them to the farm, which made it about 21 acres at its largest size. And you can see on the highest ground there over on the eastern side were fields for the crops. There were some workmen's cottages. They had orchards there straddling what is present-day Broadway. There were animal enclosures because the Audubons at this time had finished the Birds of America. They were working on the smaller editions of it, which were quite popular and financially successful for the family. But they'd also begun work on the Quadrupeds of America, and they had some of the animal specimens there on the farm. So you had a combination of domesticated farm animals and wild animals, quadrupeds or mammals, that the Audubon men, that's John James, his sons Victor and John Woodhouse, were all drawing and reproducing for this Quadrupeds of America. Down near the river was where the homestead was, with a barn a little bit north of that, and then further north of that, or farther north of that, you have the coachman's house and a stable and a barn there. The Audubons were really unusual in putting their house by the river. They did it because they wanted privacy, but most often in the 18th century, people who had property in northern Manhattan, and this goes back to the 18th and the 19th centuries, people tended to put their houses near one of the major roadways, either 10th Avenue or the Kingsbridge Road, and they tended to put them really high up because they wanted the advantage of fresh air. They also wanted to have prospects, views, and it was considered much healthier to be at a higher location than a lower one, higher elevation that is. The Audubons, however, did want privacy, and so they built their home very close to the river. You can see beyond the river or closer to the house, there's a little bit of a bay there. And they used that. They had a dock. They went out and they fished and used the water for recreation as well. So in the first few years that the Audubons were there, things went pretty well. You can see over there on the right, there was a village developing, Carmansville. It had the Church of the Intercession, which the Audubons helped to found. Eventually, it would have two more churches, a Presbyterian and a Methodist. As I say, the Audubons were doing pretty well in those first years, up until about the middle of the 1840s. Here's a picture of their house. It's a woodcut that appeared in Homes of American Authors in 1851, which was the year of Audubon's death. Now, in the 1840s, the later 1840s, as Audubon's health declined, his sons had to take over more responsibility for the business. John Woodhouse, who had been doing most of the farming, wasn't able to do that. He wasn't able to supply as much for the family table as he'd been doing. And the family just generally had some very difficult financial times. By the time Audubon died in 1851, elder son Victor had decided that the only thing that they could do to really save their finances would be to monetize their land. And so what they did was they sold off the eastern portion, and then they decided that on the western portion, they would build some houses and lease them. This would give them a steady income that would help with their finances. While all this was going on, John Woodhouse had his own idea, and that was to turn the family farm into a zoo. He was a bit ahead of his time. New York didn't have a zoo for another, 50 years or so, actually almost 70 years. But he was always a sort of creative thinker, and that was his solution to what they should do. However, before they even began developing it, Victor had another idea. And this is one of those turning points I was talking about earlier. Suppose this had happened rather than what actually did happen. What he wanted to do was to actually divide the land into regular city lots, 25 feet wide. You can see here on the auction map that they would have been oriented to the streets. And as I say, regular city lots. They even were going to sell the lots that went out under the water. The idea being, of course, that whoever bought those could drain them and use those as riverfront property. This did not actually happen. But looking at the map, a couple of things I'll point out, because it's a really wonderful map that's in the Beinecke Library at Yale. At the top, you can see that by 1851, 158th Street was already opened and gridded, opened and graded, and was about 60 feet wide, and it had macadam on it, which was an early form of pavement that mixed tar and lots of stone. 155th Street on the southern side was also graded, and both that and 158th ended at wharves along the river. Wayne, just looking at this, anything in particular strike you about the map, or the possibility of suppose this had happened instead of?
I mean, one of the things that we pointed out is the current street pattern of Audubon Park differs from the rest of the Manhattan grid. This scenario, had it gone forward, looks much closer to the typical Manhattan grid. In particular, if 12th Avenue in fact came through as this is plotted, it would have created a very different relationship to the rest of Audubon Park. You would have had blocks between what is now Broadway and 12th Avenue, and then you would have had these waterfront blocks. And the question is, how would that urban pattern differ from it is now? But it would have created a very different look and feel than the neighborhood that is created by Riverside Drive, pulling in a circuitous manner and creating this rather unique urban environment. This would have been much more regular, much more akin to what we can find elsewhere.
True, true. And interesting thing about 12th Avenue is that even though it was never developed, it appears in many deeds as a point of beginning. So it had something like beginning at a point 100 feet east of 12th Avenue and moving east, so and so and so on. So even though it was never there, it was sort of acknowledged. And the Audubons actually even had a roadway sort of winding across in the path of 12th Avenue, because when they began to divide the property, which actually we'll move to another map, you can see over there on the left, that winding road closest to the river, that is sort of in the line of 12th Avenue. And this is what actually happened. Instead of having that gridded pattern. They did go forward with dividing the property into lots and building houses to lease. If you start there at the river, O is the Audubon homestead. Then north of that is a house that Victor built for his family. And north of that, one that John Woodhouse built for his family. North of that, a house that they built for a brother-in-law. The other houses, they either leased or a couple of them they sold because the people who wanted to buy them, wanted to come, didn't want to lease, they wanted to buy instead. So P was a house that was built for Wellington Clapp, and Q for a man named Henry Smythe. A couple of interesting things about that development though. See how the roadways are all curvilinear. They're not straight roadways. You can see the dotted lines that show you where the streets would be, the gridded streets, and you can see how the roadways in Audubon Park tended to follow the topography. Notice also the lots are much larger than your regular city lot. The houses are spaced farther apart. Each of them had light and air on all four sides. Also, if you notice the topography lines there, each of the houses, particularly the ones on the eastern side, was near a promontory so that it could look over, have its own views above the rooftop of the house further west of it. So that's basically what Audubon Park looked like in its development. The name they began using around 1854. Prior to that, the farm had been called Minnie's Land, which was in honor of Audubon's wife, Lucy. Even though her name was Lucy, they called it Minnie's Land because the two sons called their mother Minnie, which is a Scottish term for mother. And she did, in fact, own the land. When Audubon bought it, he put it in her name. But around 1854, the name changed to Audubon Park and remained that way past the turn of the 20th century. Another thing though that's interesting about this map, look over on the right-hand side between 155th and 158th. That's all land that Dennis Harris owned. Now, Dennis Harris is the man who bought the eastern side of Minnie's Land from the Audubons. But look what he's already done. He's already started dividing his property into regular lots. He's oriented the houses to the grid, not to these curvilinear drives as in Audubon Park. But he's really taking a more regimented look or feel to what he is developing there and following the grid, as was Carmen doing over there in Carmensville to the right there on the map. So moving on, let's just look. Here's one more image of Audubon Park. This is from about 1864. It's a very romanticized view of Audubon Park. You can see over there on the left the Hudson River Railroad, which had opened in 1849. There was a station at 152nd Street, which really helped the Audubons when they were developing their property, because merchants who worked downtown could actually use that train to commute back and forth. Most of them had their own carriages, but in inclement weather or when they didn't want to drive the carriage downtown, they had the Hudson River Railroad that they could use, and their wives could use it for shopping trips or doctor's appointments or whatever reason they needed to go downtown. North of the Audubon House there, you can see two other houses. Those are representations of John Woodhouse's home and Victor's. Again, it's a very romanticized view, but it does give us a sense of the park nature of Audubon Park. The Audubon struggled throughout the 1850s. Victor died in 1860. His brother, John Woodhouse, died in 1862, which left three widows. If they had put their finances together, might have been able to survive there in Audubon Park, but they didn't. They each went their own way. Lucy ended up selling all of her property in 1864, as did John's widow, Caroline. Victor's widow, Georgiana, stayed on for about another decade in her house. Here's a view of the Audubon House about 6 weeks after Lucy Audubon sold it to a lawyer named Jesse Benedict. That's Jesse Benedict framed in the doorway there. I know this is not a great picture, but it was taken in 1864. That's his wife next to him. He had several daughters there arranged on the steps, as are a couple of his sons. Now, let's back up a little bit, though. We've been talking about what was happening inside Audubon Park, but what was happening outside was equally interesting. because as northern Manhattan was developing through the second half of the 19th century, more and more landowners were gaining property. That is, larger pieces of property were being divided into smaller, which made more landholders, more taxpayers, and more people to petition the state for some sort of plan for their streets. They did that in 1860, and the state legislature appointed a commission. All of the people they appointed lived in northern Manhattan, were property owners there. The one thing that everyone was unanimous about was they didn't want to have a grid. They said that the grid would disrupt the beautiful topography, and they mentioned also what the commissioners had said back at the early part of the century, that it would encourage land speculation. So the commissioners spent about $40,000. They worked for about 4 years, and they came up with absolutely nothing except for a set of spectacular maps, which are now in the borough president's office. I went down there, and one of the assistants there very kindly helped me lay out all of these pieces of grass paper, which were sketches done in the field and then put together. But look how brilliantly they were done, because when they're put together, even the roadways match up. This is looking at Audubon Park along the river. Over there on the right-hand side, you have Audubon, the homestead. Then you have those houses that John and Victor built for themselves, and the one they built for their brother-in-law, James Hall. A little bit farther to the east and to the north, that house right on 158 is the one that Dennis Harris built for himself. Dennis Harris, again, being the fellow who bought that land from the Audubons. Here are a couple of more images from that map. These are details.
Before you go forward, Matthew, here's a quick question if you go back to that
Sure.
prior. You know, when you look at this and you consider that you had, property owners, basically, telling City Hall, what they wanted vis-a-vis a street grid and what they didn't want. And you look at this, you could very easily have imagined, Audubon Park and, much of Washington Heights developing in this more, not rural, but country-like setting where you have super blocks that are, bordered by, major streets and avenues. But within these super blocks, you have individual houses and you have curvilinear streets. So the question then becomes, if you had people who were, had some say, some power advocating for this, what happened to this scheme?
Good question. Well, the first thing that happened was that these commissioners, even though everyone was anti-grid, started actually working towards grid. And I'll leave these images up there while I talk about that a little bit. On the left, you have Henry Smythe's garden, and on the right, you have Wellington Clapp's house. And again, the amount of detail that's in these maps is absolutely fabulous for anybody who's researching northern Manhattan, because the surveyors took such great care in what they were doing with these maps. But what happened was that after this set of Blackwell maps, the commissioners who were appointed actually were leaning towards a grid pattern, which infuriated the people who had helped get them appointed in the first place. And so in 1865, the state legislature, who had heard enough complaints, came up with another idea. And that was that they gave Andrew Haswell Green and the Central Park commissioners who were working with him the full authority to develop all of Manhattan west of Central Park, as well as north of Central Park, all the way to the top of the island. And the plans that Green had really would have had more of these curving drives, less of a grid pattern. One of the first things that they did was they extended Broadway all the way to 155th Street, which was, of course, Audubon Park's southern boundary, and they called it the Boulevard. That was work was begun on that during the American Civil War and was finally completed in the early 1870s. When it was, they bisected Trinity Cemetery. Up until that time, Trinity had stretched all the way from 10th Avenue to the river, but they did bisect it. They had several ideas that they began to put into effect, but not completely. For example, once the Boulevard bisected Trinity Cemetery, the idea was for it to go north another block to 156th and then branch off. You see that dotted line for the public drive. That was to be a roadway that followed the river all the way to the top of the island and then circled around and came down on the eastern side. So you would have this grand drive all the way around the top of the north of Manhattan.
And Matthew, here again, I mean, this map is a wonderful example of, what might have been. I mean, you would have, 155th Street and 158th Street and what is now Broadway, bordering, this park-like environment within which you have, individual single-family homes, and who knows whether today if they'd be single-family homes or if they'd be owned by institutions, but you would have this, preserved park-like environment where we truly would have Audubon Park as a, in a park-like setting. But once again, we're taking this virtual tour, and so this is a stop along the way, but time did not stop with this iteration.
Exactly, and a lot of factors took over. Certainly, economics was one of them, and the desires of the people who owned the property. All through the second half of the 19th century, people in northern Manhattan were talking about the promise of that area opening up to all of Manhattan. And what they envisioned was a whole line of villas, very much like the ones that were in Audubon Park, populating or being there in northern Manhattan, as opposed to, of course, what we have. When Trinity was bisected, the Trinity Church hired Vaux, Withers and Company to design an iron suspension bridge. Here's an image of it, or a photograph of it. The bridge spanned what was then the Boulevard and connected two sides of the cemetery. Just to get an idea of how large that Gothic bridge was, look down there, sitting on the sidewalk or next to the road, you see three little children. That gives you a sense of just how wide and large that bridge was. It remained there until 1914, when the Church of the Intercession built the third building housing its congregation right there in Trinity Cemetery. They had to take the bridge down because it would have gone almost in the front door, which gives you an idea of where that bridge was. Now, while all of this was going on around Audubon Park, let's go back into the park again. And one of the most important people of the park's history, that's George Blake Grinnell. He was a merchant who dealt in the cotton trade at the beginning of the American Civil War. Like many cotton merchants, he went bankrupt, and then he came back in the financial industry and was a stockbroker and was the favored broker for Cornelius Vanderbilt in his railroad stocks. They bought, George Blake Grinnell first leased and then bought the house called the Hemlocks, which was pretty much in the center of Audubon Park. When he bought it, it was an Italianate villa. However, around the end of the 1860s, early 1870s, mansard mania struck Manhattan, and every building seemed to get a mansard roof, as did the Grinnell Mansion, the Hemlocks, and several other buildings there in Audubon Park, including the original Audubon homestead. George Blake Grinnell, as I say, bought this house and the property around it in 1864, and then spent the next 20 years buying more and more property until at the time of his death, he owned about 2/3 of the property in Audubon Park. Here's some other images. On the left, you have a picture of Henry Smythe's house, which was one of the first ones that George Blake Grinnell bought when he was accumulating property. And on the right, you have a picture of the Grinnell stable, which is the only building in Audubon Park that we can say for sure who the architect was. It was Frederick Withers, who was famous for his Gothic churches. The picture on the left, I'd like to point out, was taken by one of George Blake Grinnell's granddaughters. At the turn of the century, her name was Janet Martin, and at the turn of the century, she was about maybe 12 years old, and she had a camera, and she started taking photographs of everything around her and actually captured Audubon Park at a very important moment as it was shifting from a suburban neighborhood to a cityscape. And fortunately, I was able to have access to this set of photographs from the Schuyler M. Meyer family, and I believe some of the members of the family are actually tuning in today, so hello to them. And thanks again for letting me use these fabulous photographs in the book and for this presentation. So here we have another look at Audubon Park. And this takes us back to the Grinnells for a moment. What happened was that when George Blake Grinnell died in 1893, his children inherited his property. They were having some of the same problems the Audubons had had 50 years earlier. That is, they had a lot of property that was not really paying for itself. The maintenance on it, the taxes, the insurance, the upkeep, all of those were not being paid for by the amounts that they were getting in leases. And so after the elder Grinnells died, George Blake and his wife Helen in 1893 and 94, then the younger generation set about developing an exit strategy. And it had two main pieces. One was Riverside Drive, and the other was the subway. Riverside Drive at that time in the 1890s ended at Grant's Tomb. One of the problems with it was that it wasn't long enough. Everybody complained that it didn't go anywhere. So the city's street commissioners began looking at plans and what they might do. And they remembered this earlier plan that Andrew Haswell Green had had about a roadway going around the top of Manhattan. Well, by this time, the Boulevard Lafayette had finally been developed. It was, although it was planned as early as 1873, construction didn't begin until the early 1890s. And you see the name there, Audubon Place. Well, that was where the Boulevard Lafayette began and continued on up. So the idea was that they would extend Riverside Drive up to join the Boulevard Lafayette, and then it would go around the top of the island. This was a great plan. Everybody liked it. The Grinnells liked it, except for one thing. It would bypass their property, because logically, Riverside Drive would go up the river. So they got together with some of the other property owners along the route, and they used some of their social and political connections, and they went to the state legislature, who was at that time in charge of Manhattan. There wasn't home rule at the time. The state legislature was in charge of everything. And they got a route mandated through Audubon Park. It's that Riverside Drive that you see there, sort of snaking across. The idea originally was that what was reported in the newspapers was that this was to adhere to the topography. However, most of Riverside Drive through Audubon Park was on a retaining wall, which in some places was 40 feet high. So really, what it does, Riverside Drive through Audubon Park, is it outlined the Grinnells' eastern boundary for most of their property. So what they had done was they had been able to, again, working with their allies, get Riverside Drive and a Riverside address for most of their property through Audubon Park. On this particular map, you can see changes that were beginning to take place around 1907. The Grinnells had begun selling their property, and so you can see that some of the houses had disappeared. You can also see that they had cut off with Riverside Drive the houses over there closest to the river. Then we're going to come back to this map, but I want to just take a moment also to talk about the subway, because the subway was a key.
Matt, could you go back?
Yes, Wayne?
Go back a second.
Certainly.
So if we just stay on this map for a second, and you mentioned how the footprint of Audubon Park, it's beginning to resemble what we know today. But if we look at the size, sort of the figure ground buildings that are, from Amsterdam Avenue going west. And then we look at M and N, which are even today 2 5- or 6-story apartment buildings. I just wonder what everyone who lived in the area at the time thought about them, because they are a completely different building type, a completely different density than anything else in the area.
That's exactly right, Wayne. And I think it must have been a shock to see these apartment buildings in particular begin to appear on the landscape, because for a while, Audubon Park was the lagger. It wasn't a leader. And most of the area around it had developed a good 3 or 4 years before the Grinnells finally sold their property. And so you had, for example, one of the first apartment buildings that appeared was the Lafayette, which was a small sort of French flat building, which isn't on this map. I don't think. No, it is not. But anyway, the Lafayette had more people in it by a factor of 10 than had lived in any villa in Audubon Park during its entire history, and yet it had about the same footprint. So you're right, it was this, not only the new buildings, but the density of the population jumped dramatically there at the turn of the 20th century. And so again, one of the reasons that happened was because the subway came north. Here are a couple of pictures of 158th Street. One is it's June 1900 and the other is October, June on the left, October on the right. You can see how quickly they were working with excavating the subway. This was a strategic point because 158th Street was where the cut and cover technique, which you can see there, they dug it out, built the tunnel, covered it up. That's where that ended and the blasting and tunneling began going farther north. At the same time, the Audubons sold some of their property, the Grinnells sold some of their property to Archer Huntington, who had plans for first his Hispanic Society Museum, which you can see being built there on the right, and then a whole museum complex, which also included a Spanish church, and you can see that there on the left. That's the original configuration. The one today is quite different because the facade is right there at the sidewalk. The entrance is on the lower level, and you go upstairs inside rather than outside on that grand plaza. In that picture, though, of the Hispanic Society under construction with the men standing there posing on the roof, a little bit there on the right, you can see just a small portion of Wellington Clapp's house, which was still there. And there on the left, you can see part of Charles Kerner's stable, which had actually begun life as a house that Carl Wildemeister and his wife Wilhelmina had built back in 1851. Somewhere along the way, it got converted to a stable. Here's another image of the Hispanic Society once it was finished, with the Numismatic Society next to it before the extension to the Hispanic Society covered that space in between the two. Notice though that you still had a very park-like feeling. This was in the early 1900s. You still had a very park-like feeling there, even at the museum complex. Now, one thing that happened with all of this development was that Audubon's house was really submerged. There on the left, you have another of the photos from that wonderful photo album from the Schuyler Meyer family. You can see just the top of Audubon's house there as Riverside Drive is being constructed. And there on the right, you can see a later view, this is about 1914, of the Audubon House, the homestead there up against Riverside Drive with the 780 Riverside, the Vauxhall there in the background. And let's go back to that map, Wayne, because there's some really interesting things to look at here. This is that transitional period when you have, as you just mentioned, an apartment building there right on Audubon Place, which is now Edward M. Morgan Place. You still had the Hemlocks, which is L. You had Riverside Drive, which is on this huge retaining wall. And then you had two old houses, and then you had two museums. And there on 158th Street, you had a row of houses, which John P. Leo and his wife Isabel had built in the 1890s, between 1896 and 1898. So you have all these different building formats there sharing the space together. When you look at that map, Wayne, you know, coming as you're an architect and planner, what are some of the things that you see there?
Well, I mean, frankly, what you see are when I remember in grad school, they compared the Bronx and Cambridge and other places to sort of a plum pudding, where you do not have a consistent urban fabric. You have a number of things going on, and the street grid kind of pulls it all together. So, I mean, what you see here are, quite literally, building types that are from, different eras and are being driven by different economic considerations, but they're being, held in place, by that street grid.
True, and by the street grid and by that old Audubon Park footprint, which no matter how far we evolve away from it, is always there sort of as a layer of our history. Now here is 158th Street, those row houses I was just talking about when they were new. And down at the end of the block, you can see the house that Dennis Harris had built back in 1851. It had been owned for quite some time when this picture was taken by Shepard Knapp. When all this was happening, one of the people who lived on 158th Street was Reginald Pelham Bolton. He lived right in the middle of the block. And he, among his many other activities, was an early preservationist. And he also, of course, was self-interested because he lived on 158th Street. He didn't want to have apartment buildings in his backyard. And so he came up with a plan for developing the remnants of Audubon Park there on the western side of Riverside Drive and below that 40-foot retaining wall, developing them into parkland. You can see the Audubon House he was going to have restored in his plan. There would be an aviary, which was where John Woodhouse Audubon's home was, and there was a lodge, which was where that house I just pointed out, Shepard Knapp's house, was. He presented all of this to the American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society in 1905. They didn't really support him on the idea, but again, it's really fascinating to think, suppose that had been what developed instead of what we actually had there on that side of Riverside Drive. And this gives you—
argue that it was an early example of what today we would call community-based planning.
Exactly, Wayne. And it reflects, groups that have evolved since. Bolton was working with the Washington Heights Taxpayers Association, which were mainly landowners, property owners in Washington Heights. That group went out of business, or they stopped operating in the 1840s. But that didn't end people's advocating for the neighborhoods. We have, for example, the community board, and members of the community can work on community board. We also had the historic district effort there in the early 2000s, which was successful. Starting, excuse me, starting in the teens, there was another effort. Our neighbor Vivian Ducat has been leading a group trying to get 158th Street added to the Audubon Park Historic District, or at least districted as its own. And now we have another group which has just formed recently because of a concern about a house that's to be demolished north of 158th Street, and the building which might go there, which would be quite out of scale, or potentially out of scale with the ones that are there already.
Well,
but if you look at, sorry,
things about that, Matthew. What's interesting is when the Landmarks Preservation Commission came to Community Board 12, probably in 2008, to get its recommendations on what the boundaries of the historic district, should be. And they told us that, once they set the boundaries, they can take buildings out of it, the study area, but they cannot add it. So what the community board recommended was a much larger area than what was designated, and it in fact included the buildings on 158th Street that are currently being discussed, but also what we refer to in the neighborhood as the upper and lower drive, basically Riverside Drive going north of 158th Street. We recommended that basically Landmarks study that entire area, because as we look at this map from 1915 or even from 1907 to the 30s, there's a lot of development. It's not all the same era, but it has an interesting story to tell in terms of the urbanization of Upper Manhattan. And we thought all of the buildings were worthy of inclusion in a historic district.
Yes, exactly. And I think, you know, one of the things that we always emphasize, emphasize on walks through Audubon Park, and I noticed the first day that I arrived in the neighborhood in October 1987, is that the neighborhood has a distinct feel to it, a sense of place to it. Part of that is because of that curving Riverside Drive, the Oval Park, which is T on the map there, Audubon Place, which is now Edward M. Morgan Place, and then the continuation of Riverside Drive on up beyond 158th Street. And it has a sense, as I say, a sense of place, a sense of neighborhood that is rooted, again, in that old Audubon Park footprint. By this time, oh yes, wait.
Photo of the drive.
I beg your pardon? Oh yes.
Backwards.
An interesting thing about you said about the topography of the drive, going back, yes.
Right. If you look at that, and look, this is December, 1928, so my mother was 1 year old. But we often talk about how Riverside Drive, it pulled inland and it followed the natural topography and all this wonderful romantic stuff. But if you look at this picture, you really see how that's far from true. Riverside Drive in this location has created its own level. It's created its own topography, and it really imprisons the natural topography. You look at where the elevation of the cemetery is. If you look at the houses that are now, walled off, Riverside Drive is not at all following the natural topography. And as you mentioned, what this represents is, the use of power and influence to shape the urban environment, which is of course not news to us, but we often look at this and talk about Riverside Drive in romantic terms that maybe are not, quite truthful.
Exactly, and another thing that's really interesting is that Riverside Drive then set the grade for 156 and 157, because if they had been developed, say back at 1851, when the Audubons were thinking of dividing it, they would have been streets that were just as steep as present-day 155th and 158th, which go down almost to river level. But because Riverside Drive came through, 156th and 157th met that level rather than the earlier topographical level. I see that we're getting really close to the hour. So let me just move on and just show a couple of other slides, and we're almost here at the end if the folks who've joined us will stick with us a couple more minutes. This is a really interesting photograph from 1926. On the left, you have July 1926, and this is 156th Street. If you remember earlier, the Hispanic Society images I was showing you faces 156, and the original entrance was on 156, which gave that street an entirely different feel from what it has now. In 1926, the Hispanic Society desperately needed extra space for storage and for showing part of its collection. And so they built what's called the North Building, and then next to it is now a sculpture court. But as you can see in these two images, that cut off the residents of 156th Street from the Hispanic Society and changed the whole character of that street. So even though the footprint of the neighborhood was set, there were these changes that continued on beyond that, the footprint being put in place. And so here we are back at where we started with a map of the interlocking Audubon Park Historic District and the Audubon Terrace Historic District. We've given you a really sort of whirlwind tour. I hope that you have enjoyed it and have been able to keep up. And if not, there's a great book that's just come out called The Neighborhood Manhattan Forgot. And it's available at booksellers, and it tells this whole story in much more detail. But again, thanks to HDC for having us tonight to talk with you about the development of Audubon Park. And Wayne, how about if I hand it back to you for closing out?
Well, thank you, Matthew. And, I think this was a wonderful introduction, as you mentioned. I mean, the book will offer, much more detail and much greater opportunity to explore the development of Audubon Park or the urbanization of this part of Manhattan in more detail. I know that we wanted to get to a few questions, and while we're running a little late, Michelle, I wonder, are there any key or cluster of questions that Matthew and I can quickly address?
We have one that says, did Audubon Park precede Lowell Park, which is considered one of the first suburban developments?
Llewellyn Park?
Llewellyn
Yes.
Park that's in New Jersey, right?
I am not sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
please. Audubon Park was at a time when there were other parks being developed. I'm not sure that the Audubons really were using that model, if they actually even knew about that model. And the name, actually, Audubon Park, came about, I think, as really a real estate development term, because Minnie's land, although it was accurate in describing what the farm had been, Minnie, that is Lucy Audubon, owned it, wasn't nearly as evocative as using the Audubon name and the park-like setting. It does have some elements like Llewellyn Park and other of the parks that were being developed in the mid-19th century, but I'm not positive. I've never been able to find anything definitive that the Audubons were aware of that movement and were taking part in it.
Thanks, Matthew. What else do we have, Michelle?
We have one that says, what was the impact of the New York Central tracks to the area when that was being constructed?
Well, there are two things. One was the Audubons were horrified that a railroad was coming next to their property, and they considered suing the city to keep it from happening. Well, actually, not the city suing the railroad company, but they quickly realized that the railroad company had deep pockets and that wasn't going to work. However, as it turned out, it was a boon for them because of that station at 152nd Street, because with that, the population could come to them whom they were trying to draw. It's really interesting when you look at the profile of those first people who moved into Audubon Park, either leasing or buying the houses. They were all merchant class. They were all young men who were starting their families. They all had sort of pedigrees to them. That is, they had recognizable ancestors. And they were all Episcopalians. They all went to the Audubon's church, the Church of the Intercession. It was almost as if there was a co-op board sort of vetting all of these people who moved into Audubon Park. I have a feeling Lucy Audubon may have been behind some of that. She was very, very, very class conscious.
Somebody wants to know who Edward W. Morgan was.
Great question. Edward M. Morgan was a postmaster. He was the first New York City postmaster to rise to that level from having begun as a postal carrier. He didn't live anywhere nearby. He lived down in the 140s, but he was very beloved. He was also the postmaster during the first airmail delivery in the United States. A plane took off from in Long Island and flew out. It escapes me now where it flew. Anyway, it didn't land. They dropped the bag of mail from the plane. It exploded on impact. However, it is still considered the first delivery of mail by air in the United States. So it was renamed, that little stretch of what was originally the Boulevard Lafayette was renamed Edward M. Morgan Place in the 1920s.
Vivian wants to know, did Intercession move from where it is now to 158th and then back to where it moved from where it is now at 158th and then back again? That's how it looks like. That's what it looks on the map.
Right. No, Intercession started over on 10th Avenue, on Amsterdam Avenue at 153rd, outside the gates of Trinity Cemetery. Then in 1873, they moved to 158th Street. And then they moved back to the cemetery inside the cemetery at 155th. And it's very interesting, and I write about this a bit in the book, of the sort of tension between Trinity Church and Intercession and their symbiotic relationship. Because intercession actually superseded plans that Trinity Church had for a chapel inside the cemetery, and stayed that way for more than 50 years. Then when intercession was running into deep financial problems, Trinity Church stepped in again, took over their financial problems and their building, built the new church, which was the chapel of the intercession. It was a satellite of Trinity Church until the 1970s, when it gained its independence and became Church of the Intercession again. It's a really fascinating history looking at these two Episcopal churches and the relationship between them and the tension between them.
That kind of leads to another question where someone said, did the Church of the Intercession object to Trinity Church establishing its cemetery right behind it?
It was really the other way around. Trinity Church had developed the cemetery, and when you look at the earliest plans, there was space allotted right on Amsterdam Avenue, 10th Avenue then, Amsterdam Avenue, between 154th and 155th for a church. But they were building their own church down in Wall Street at the same time. While their attention was on that, the Audubons, Richard Carman, the Moorheads, the Monroes, various families in northern Manhattan decided that they wanted their own Episcopal church. And so they formed the Church of the Intercession. Once Trinity saw this was happening, they said, okay, fine, you can have your church. And they worked out a deal that they would pay a certain part of the rector's salary every year in exchange for using the church for funeral services in the cemetery. And that was part of the relationship that continued, as I was saying, for the next 50 years.
Okay, I think you've answered all the other questions we have in here. Someone did ask if it's being recorded. It is being recorded. It will be available on the HDC website as well as on our YouTube channel, along with all of our other virtual walking tours and walking tours that we've done, video walking tours that we did all like pre-COVID as well. So go to our YouTube channel, check that out. We have a lot. And then mostly everyone else is saying that it was great and thank you. And I ditto to that.
Thank everyone for participating in this. Matthew, I want to thank you for your dedicated effort to research, the development of the area. It's wonderful. You've presented to the community board a number of times as you were working on this, and it's always fascinating. And just another plug for HDC, saving landmarks. I mean, it's a group activity, and I encourage everyone to support HDC, to check out its webpage and see how you can get involved and how you can help HDC, to advance its mission.
Thank you. Also, if you would like more information about Audubon Park, we also have it on the Six to Celebrate website, as they were one of our Six to Celebrate groups. So we have a self-guided walking tour guide along with all the information about various sites.
Great. Thanks very much.
And Bruce Robinson says, buy the book.
He said that he has it.
Very good.
Okay, well, if there are no other questions, I think we are good. So thank you both very much, and thank you everyone for coming out tonight. And I will hopefully see you all in one way or another soon.
Okay.
Thanks, Michelle. Good night.
Good night.
Good night, all.